this morning a bit of my story of how I came from atheism to faith, and I do this knowing that many of you may already know the story. Some of you have heard it all before. I've never actually preached it from Warburton, believe it or not. My practice has been to go to any new church that I go to. I usually share my testimony to begin with, because it helps people to get to know who I am and maybe get to know why I'm as quirky as I am. But I will share it again another lesson. Obviously there are many here who I don't know, and hopefully this will help us get a little better acquainted. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing your story too, because the Lord leads us in unique ways, and I'm looking forward to hearing those stories. Before we begin, I would like to share a couple of verses from the Bible. And one is in Revelation chapter 12 and in verse 11. In Revelation chapter 12 and verse 11, it talks about the overcomers. It says, they overcame him, that's the enemy, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They overcame him, that's the devil, the enemy. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They overcame him by what Jesus did for us on the cross, the blood of the Lamb, and by what they have to say about what Jesus has done for us on the cross. And so testimony is a powerful tool that God has given us in order to share what great things God has done for us as individuals. And one final verse before I share the story, and it's possibly one of my favourite verses in Scripture. It's John 8:32, and they apparently, if you go to Langley, Virginia in the United States, and you go into the building of the CIA, the headquarters of the CIA, you go into the lobby, and on the wall they have these words chiseled into the wall, which is John 8:32, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And I've never felt freer than becoming a Christian, believe it or not. I know some people think that when you become a Christian, it's like a straitjacket. Can't do anything. And that's how some people see Christianity. And I would have seen Christianity that way. But I now realise it's not a straitjacket, but a life jacket. And the gospel is there to save us and save our souls. I was born and raised in Birmingham, England, and that's where that is, that little marker. I was born and raised in Birmingham, England, and lived there for the first 26 years of my life. And I was raised in a typical secular home in the UK. Now, my dad was an agnostic. That is, he wouldn't say there is no God, but he wouldn't know much either way and wasn't really interested. And my dad sort of thought that all the, religion started all the wars, and you can sympathise with that, point of view. And then my mum was a once-a-month Anglican. I say was, she's still around, my dear mum. But when I was growing up, she would go to the local Anglican church once a month. And that was our household. But we didn't have a Bible in the house. We didn't pray at our house. We didn't talk about God unless it was a throwaway word. And so I went to state school. And when we were at state school, we learned about evolution. And I believed that was the way we all came to be. And so that was normal for me. And so I went to state primary school, then high school, and this is a picture. Let me tell you a little bit about Birmingham. So Birmingham, there are a couple of companies you might know from Birmingham. One is Cadbury's, and I'm sure that you don't eat that stuff, right? I went down, we were at Tasmania for the last 2 years, and Tasmanians think Cadbury's comes from Tasmania because they have a factory there. But the factory there is not as old as the one in Birmingham. So John Cadbury opened a shop in Birmingham and began his little chocolate empire there, and then moved to a suburb by the name of Bourneville, which is why you have Bourneville chocolate. And half my family worked there. And the reason I mention this, half my family worked there. So on my mother's side, my grandfather, my aunt, my uncle and my cousin all worked at Cadbury's. And then one of the other more famous manufacturers in Birmingham, England was the car manufacturing industry, and we used to make the minis, the little minis. And my grandfather, all three or two uncles, my father and myself, all worked at Austin Rover. I used to put petrol tanks into minis, 200 a day. And there was another guy doing the same thing, putting 200 a day in, so 400 cars were rolling off the production line, and I worked there for a little bit. But let me take you a little bit back further. That's a picture of me aged 14. And I've been trying to recreate that hairstyle for a while. It's not working for me. But that's me at age 14. And I put that up there for a couple of reasons. When I was 14, I had a friend who was younger than me, but he looked older than me. He was tall and, a bit bulky, and he looked older, and he could buy alcohol and cigarettes. And so at 14, he introduced me to alcohol and cigarettes. And that was just what everybody was doing in my sort of circle at that time. But also at 14, I remember one of my grandparents. I had 4 wonderful grandparents, and one of my grandparents got sick. And I began to think about the fact that, my grandparents are getting old, they'll get sick, and then they'll ultimately die, and then my parents are going to get old, and they'll get sick, and they'll die, and then I'm going to get old, and I'll get sick, and I'll die. What's the point? What's the point to life? And I remember thinking that as a 14-year-old. And even though I was an atheist, and I believed that evolution was the way we came here, I remember as a 14-year-old, we'd come from school, we'd go up the park, especially in the summer months, and when it was warmer, we'd go up the park after school and play football. That's soccer for the uninitiated, but proper football. And we'd go and play football. And I remember there was a kid who was 12, and his family went to the Anglican church, the local Anglican church, every week. And so he would go to church. And I remember giving him a hard time. How can you believe in God? Don't you know about evolution? And I would give him a hard time. So that was me at 14. The next picture, I think, is me at 19. And I was in with a group of friends who, if they, I was a follower of my friends. I didn't really have an idea of personal identification. I didn't know who I was. And so if my friends were doing one thing, then that's what I would do. That's why I got into cigarettes and alcohol. I didn't really enjoy getting into cigarettes and alcohol to begin with. Certainly cigarettes, which was amazing because my dad smoked like a chimney. And our house was like the November fog. You'd walk into our house on a Saturday afternoon. It was like the November fog. That's the environment I grew up in. And but I started smoking at 14 and drinking just because other people did. And then at 19, I had some friends who were dyeing their hair, so I dyed my hair. They were getting ear piercing, so I got my ear pierced. And I was just follower of my friends. And I really didn't know who I was. And I had a friend a little later who had a T-shirt and it said, "Boldly going nowhere." And I figured that's probably what I was doing at the time. I was boldly going nowhere. Well, at 16, I left school. I had no idea what I wanted to do, so my dad said, "Look, I'll get you into a car mechanic apprenticeship." So I did car mechanics for about 3 years. Then I got made redundant. And then I got a job at the car factory where we were putting those petrol tanks in minis. And I was working there I did that for 6 months, and it was interesting work for about a half an hour. After that, it was just the same thing over and over and over again, day in, day out. And and I'm looking at some of the 40-odd-year-olds, working on the track in this car factory, and and they've been there for years, and I'm thinking, is this my life now? Is this what I'm going to do? I had a couple of friends who, at that time, got work in a new restaurant company that opened in Birmingham. And this restaurant company was called TGI Fridays. I think I've got it there. There it is. A new American restaurant company that had come into the UK, and they just opened their first restaurant in Birmingham. And two of my mates, they were working there and said, "Pete, this is a great place to work. It's like a party every night. You should come and work here." And I'd had 6 months of working in the factory, and I thought, there's got to be more to life than this. And so I started work at TGI Fridays as a cocktail bartender, and I did that for 4 years. And this was not your average pulling pints kind of bartender. This was a juggling, performing, joke-telling, trick-performing bartender. And they taught you how to do all of that stuff. And I did that for 4 years. And this is a picture of me at about that time. This would have been about 1990, I think. And around that time, the company, TGI Fridays, was involved with making a film called Cocktail with Tom Cruise in it. And Tom Cruise was going to play this bartender, and the first bar that he walks into is a TGI Fridays bar, and so they were working with him, and people from our company trained him to do all the bottle flipping and all of that stuff. And so when that film came out, we had extra work because there would be hotels and nightclubs and bars that would hire you to perform to, promote the film. And so we were doing that for a while. About that time, there was a young man who came to work at TGI Fridays in Birmingham. His name was Steve. Now, what I didn't know at the time was Steve was raised Seventh-day Adventist. And that's rare over there, I've got to tell you. But he was raised Seventh-day Adventist. I had no knowledge of that. I'd never even heard of Seventh-day Adventists. And he began working. He was doing the same job as me, working in the cocktail bar, and he and I actually both got booked on the same TV show. He actually got sick, and we ended up working on different TV shows, juggling bottles and doing all sorts. But we became friends, and he picked up a girl over the bar. Her name was Lisa. And he and his girlfriend and me, my girlfriend, we go out socially together and we work together, and we got on well. One day we were working here. This is called the service bar. Has anybody ever seen the TV show Cheers? We'll excommunicate you straight away. The TV show Cheers has this big wooden square bar in the middle of the restaurant, right? And that's exactly how Fridays was. It was a 4-pillar square bar, just like that. But they also had another bar in the kitchen to service all the tables. So the waitresses would come to that bar and collect drinks to take to all the tables. It was a 230-seat restaurant. And Steve was working in there, and I happened to be working in there with him one day. And one of the waitresses pushed over a slip of paper for the orders. They'd write out their orders and put them on a spike and so forth. And they all had register numbers on the bottom of these drinks orders. And this particular one ended in 666. And Steve points that out and he said, "You know that's in the Bible, don't you?" And I thought, I have no idea, but get away from me. The only thing I knew about 666 was I used to watch the horror films, about the Omen and stuff that they made in the 70s and 80s. And I thought, I don't know, but I don't want to know. And I thought, what a strange question to ask. Well, Steve and I continued working, and after a while, we had an opportunity to study for a Master Bartender Certificate. Yes, there is such a thing. And you could become a Master Bartender. And what it meant was you had to study, and you had to do exams, and you had to memorize 400 different cocktails. And you had to know what glass it went in, and what kind of ice it got, and what kind of garnish it got, and how much it cost, and what category it was, and all the different ingredients for 400 different drinks. And you do exams. And you also had to do all sorts of other tests as well. But we were studying for this. So we would work from about 5 in the evening to about 1:30. I think it was scheduled 5 till 1, but you never got out at 1. And you might got out at 1:30 or 2 o'clock sometimes if it was really busy and there was lots to clean up. And we'd finish at 1:30 at night, and then we'd go around to his house or go around to my house and hit the books, because we're studying for this Master Bartender Certificate. Well, one night we were around Steve's house, and we took a break. He went to put the kettle on, and he comes back with this folder called the Pictorial Aid for Bible Study. Now, it's not this one. It was an older one. It had a plain blue cover. But it's a book of pictures and charts that try to help people understand Bible teachings. And he's showing me this book, and it's got these man made of different metals and a 4-headed leopard, and I'm looking at this and I have no idea what you're talking about. I just have no idea. But I remember that on the inside cover it had an address. And the address, and it said, printed at the Signs Publishing Company, Warburton, Victoria, Australia. And I remember looking at the address and thinking, why has this guy got a folder from Australia? Who has a folder from Australia when you live in England, really? I mean, nothing in England's printed in Australia. It's either printed in England or it's printed in America or it might be printed in Europe, but nothing's printed in Australia. And I saw the address and I remembered the address. Had no idea what the contents of the book was all about. That was just like... I thought the Bible was like the Lord of the Rings or something like that. Because Steve was into the Lord of the Rings too, and he would, he was an artist. He'd sketch things and he'd make drawings of some of the characters that he'd read in the books. I hadn't seen the film or anything, they hadn't come out. But he was into the Lord of the Rings, and I thought, well, the Bible, the Lord of the Rings, same thing, right? Just a book about myths and fables, just a story. And that's as much as I thought about it. Well, time went by and Steve left the bar work. We remained friends. He left the bar work and then I eventually left the bar work. He became a driving instructor and I became a sales rep for a glass processing company. But we would still catch up socially, and when I was at Steve's house, he would always pull something out. He'd gotten accustomed to pulling out the Bible or pulling out something and saying, hey, have you seen this? And I go, yeah, righto, yeah, here we go. And sometimes when you've got a friend who's got a hobby, but it's not your hobby, but you humour them. You allow them to gabble on. Some of us are married to people like that, right? Their hobby's not my hobby, but you persevere. And so Steve was showing me things in the Bible, and one Sunday I was round his house one Sunday, and he was showing me some pictures and saying, the whole world, the geology of the world has been affected by a global flood. There's lots of geology in the world that looks like it's flood geology, and the Bible says that there was a global flood at the time of Noah. And he talked about that, and then he said, at the end of the flood, God put a rainbow in the sky as a promise that he would never again flood the world. And I remember saying, I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, I didn't know the Bible I didn't know the Bible said anything about rainbows. Now, I didn't know the Bible said anything about anything. I mean, the closest I would have got is David and Goliath, and that was about the FA Cup, because a little team would beat a bigger team, and they'd say on the radio, oh, it's another David and Goliath story. The little team beat the big team. And that's about as much as I knew. And but I remember saying, I didn't know the Bible said anything about rainbows. The very next morning was a Monday morning. I was driving into Birmingham on my way to work. It was raining, which was not unusual for Birmingham, but it was raining. But across the middle of the road, it was the Bristol Road going into the centre of Birmingham. I still remember it as clear as day. It was the brightest and most beautiful rainbow I'd ever seen. And when I saw the rainbow, something happened in here. And I don't know how to describe it in words other than to say that I burst into tears. I had this emotional response. I pulled over to the side of the road and I recognised at that moment, I knew that God existed and I knew the rainbow was there for me. And don't ask me how I know that, but it was in here. Anybody could say, oh, well, you just happened to be driving along the next day and you saw a rainbow. Big deal, what a coincidence. But you can't describe what happens in the heart. You can't discount for that. And so I burst into tears, and I wasn't accustomed to bursting into tears. I pulled over on the side of the road, and I realised that God existed, and I realised the rainbow was for me. And that was both awesome and terrifying at the same time. Because I recognised that I was a sinner, and God was God. And I thought, what does this mean for me? Because I recognised I was a selfish person. I was just living for me. And I remember picking up the phone and saying to Steve, Steve, did you see the rainbow? Well, after that, when I got together with Steve, I began to listen a little more to what he said. And the next thing I remember him telling me from the Bible was Daniel chapter 2. And when we studied Daniel chapter 2, and when the penny dropped, I remember him showing me a video by Kenneth Cox. It was a video cassette. You remember those? video cassette of Kenneth Cox and his presentation on Daniel chapter 2. And when the penny dropped on Daniel chapter 2, I said, that is not an ordinary book. Because who knows the future? Who could do that? This is 2,500 years old, that story. And I was absolutely amazed at Daniel chapter 2. And I don't know, I decided, well, this is not an ordinary book. I didn't know that was in there. I don't know anything was in here. And I took the Bible as being a divinely inspired book. The next thing, there were 4 things that Steve taught me in the next few weeks. We'd get together each week and he'd teach me something. It was Daniel 2, and then the next thing he taught me about was the Sabbath. And it probably took about an hour. You go through some of the major verses on the Sabbath, creation, and then, the 10 Commandments and some of the verses in the Old Testament. And Jesus kept the Sabbath. And then he pulled the calendar down and said, the seventh day is Saturday. And I said, no way. No way. The Sabbath of the Bible is Saturday. I said, that can't be right. Everybody in the world knows that the Christian day of worship is Sunday. Right? I could not believe. I still find it hard to believe. But I was raised in secular England, and whilst you were not a practicing Christian, you were aware of certain things. Like Christians go to church on Sunday. They sing hymns. I don't know. I didn't know much else about what they did. I thought they sat in church and prayed all day and sang hymns all day, and I didn't think that was very exciting. But I thought, are you telling me? Well, you're not telling me. It's there in the Bible. That the Sabbath was Saturday, and that blew me away. I could not believe that the Sabbath was Saturday. I thought, this book's got lots of secret stuff in it that I've never heard before. The third thing he taught me about was what happens when you die. That the dead are asleep in the grave until the resurrection at the end of the world. And that made so much sense to me, because as an evolutionist, I thought when you're dead, you're dead. I didn't believe in people floating around and, coming back to visit you and all of that. Now, of course, there is a resurrection at the end of the world, but the idea that the dead are asleep in the grave until the resurrection at the end of the world, that made so much sense to me. And by this time, my 4 beautiful grandparents had all passed away. And I thought to myself, if God were real and God resurrects the dead and my parents or grandparents are somewhere alive, why wouldn't God let them talk to me? And why wouldn't God want me to talk to them? They still love me, I still love them. Why wouldn't God want us to communicate? And it began to all make sense. And the 4th thing that he taught me about that made a big impression was the truth about hell. Because again, the common notion of Christianity is they go to church on Sunday, they sing hymns, they do all these things, and if you don't love God, he's going to burn you in hell forever and ever and ever. People know about that stuff, even if they're not practicing Christians. And it's that stuff that turns people away from wanting to be Christians. And when I understood that the Bible teaches our God is a consuming fire, and that sin cannot exist in his presence, and God is trying his best to sort us out and sort our sin out before he comes back in glory, and that God will ultimately destroy sin. And that's a good thing, by the way. I do a sermon on the good news about hell, and I talk about how could hell possibly be good news? Well, one of the things that's good news about hell is God's going to put an end to sin. We all should say, praise the Lord. Because sin is the bad stuff. Sin is the stuff that causes all the misery and destruction and disease and death in the world. And so when I understood those 4 things, Daniel 2, the Sabbath, the state of the dead and hell, I thought, this is an amazing book. Somebody should tell people about this. Somebody should say, people should know this stuff, because I didn't know this. And I probably, the reality was, until I had the encounter with God, on the road. I wasn't ready to hear any of that, so I could care less. But thankfully God got my attention. Anyway, we did these Bible studies, and then we started having this small group Bible study on a Wednesday night, and Steve was there, and Lisa, the girl he picked up over the bar, I was there. There was another waitress called Diane, and we would get together on a Wednesday night and study the Bible. And after a few weeks, we'd been doing this about 3 weeks, and Steve decided he needed to get some reinforcements because we'd ask him questions that he didn't have answers to, and he thought, I'll call a pastor I used to know. So the pastor used to come along, and he'd answer our questions. And after about 2 or 3 weeks of doing Bible studies on that Wednesday night and the pastor coming along, Steve said to me after one of those meetings, he said, you know what? He says, I know the truth. I'm going to go back to church. And I said, okay, I'll come with you. And his first day back at church was my first day at church. And we go along here. We've jumped a few pages here. This is an early picture of us going to church. So that was outside of the Worcester Seventh-day Adventist Church in the UK. And the reason we went to Worcester was I was still living in Birmingham. Steve and his wife, Lisa, had moved out to Kidderminster. And then another half hour on from that was Worcester. And so I used to go down to his house on a Friday night, stay the night with him, and then we'd go on to Worcester Church. And so we went to Worcester Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's an earlier picture. That wouldn't have been the first day, but that pastor there is Pastor John Saxby, who's no longer with us, but a lovely old pastor. And when we first went to Worcester Seventh-day Adventist Church, we walked in there. It's in the shadow of the great cathedral that's up the hill in Worcester. And it's a very small building, very small church, very plain. You know, if ever I'd gone to church for a wedding or a funeral or whatever, there were statues here and all sorts of stuff. This was very plain. And there were about 20 people there, and they didn't have any wonderful musicians. Nice to see you, Murray, by the way. Murray used to be my next door neighbour. I don't know if anybody knows that, but nice to see you. Are you moving back permanently? We'll catch up later. Where was I? Okay, so the church. So there were about 20 people there. They didn't have any musicians, so they're singing a cappella out of the old hymnal, not the current hymnal, but the old hymnal. They're singing a cappella. And we went along to Sabbath school, which, by the way, is still my favourite time of church, is Sabbath school, because you get to discuss the Word of God, you get to find out things from other people, you get to ask questions. To me, it's my favourite time of church. But we went to Sabbath school, and the guy presenting Sabbath school, he had long, grey, straggly hair and a long, grey, straggly beard, and I was going, wow, he looks like Moses. You know, he was interesting. Lovely man. His name was Jim, and he was teaching the Sabbath school lesson. And then just a small group of people, and I was quiet as a mouse because I didn't know anything, and I'm just sort of listening and watching, and I didn't even know how to turn up the verses in the Bible. And there was a guy at the back with a big bag of books, and every so often he used to say, and Sister White says. And I used to think Sister White was a member who was away that week, because I had no idea who Sister White was. I've since come to be a great appreciator of Sister White's work. But that was Sabbath school. Then we went into church and had the sermon, and that was great. And then we moved into the hall, which was an even smaller room. And they said, we're going to have lunch. And so they had a small table, and on the table there was a plate of sliced tomato, a plate of sliced cucumber, and a plate of sliced round grey things, which I've since learned are nuttolene. I'd never seen it before in my life. I thought they were coasters. I'd never seen them before. I said, is that food? never seen it before in my life. I've since learned to appreciate nuttolene. But anyway, so it was an interesting experience, my first day at church. But here's the thing. I kept going back to church for two principal reasons. Number one, the people were friendly. They were nice people. They were friendly enough. But secondarily, they taught the Bible. And while some of the other things were a little bit weird to me, I kept going back because the people were friendly and they taught the Bible. And I still think those are two good characteristics for a church. Anyway, I would go along, but I had a problem. I probably had many problems. But I had a problem because I had another church. I was a season ticket holder for Aston Villa Football Club. And they typically played on Saturday afternoon. And so I would be at the Villa, at the football. And of course, if they were playing away, well, then I'd go to church. But if they were playing at home, I'd be at the football. So I had my two churches. And so whilst I knew God was real from the road, the experience on the road, and from now studying the Bible, there's a difference to knowing that God exists and to knowing Him in a relationship such that you've given your heart to God. And there is a difference. And I had not given my heart to God. I like the idea of having God in my life, but I kind of wanted Him in my back pocket. And I'm probably sharing one of my other sermons, which we'll preach later on. But sometimes we want God in our back pocket. And you just pull Him out when we need Him, and then we pop Him back in when we don't. But the reality is we need to be in God's back pocket. And He pulls us out when He needs us. And He uses us in the area that we finds us in. God works through us. We don't say, hey Lord, can I have a bit of the Holy Spirit please? I just want to do some magic here. God uses us for the salvation of others. So anyway, church was an interesting experience, and I had this thing going on where I was at the football and what have you. During this time, some other bartender friends of mine had gone to Australia for a year. They'd gone on a working holiday to Australia, and they came back from Australia and said, Pete, Australia's a great place. You've got to go there. And so me and a couple of buddies, another bartender buddy, all my friends were bartenders at this point, we started saving. We said, we'll save for a year, and then we'll go to Australia for a year. And so we saved, and towards the end, should I tell you the year? Towards the end of 1992, we decided we would fly out to Australia. And I remember Jim, the Sabbath school teacher, saying to us, oh, you're going out to Australia. He said, that'll be wonderful. He said, what'll you do for work? I said, well, I'll probably get bar work. And he said, well, what about alcohol? And I said, well, what about alcohol? Because I had no idea. I thought Jesus turned water into wine, right? That's what that's what most people say. And I had no idea. And so went to Australia, went to Perth for 3 months. Then I was running out of money. I basically holidayed for 5 months because we left in November, and then we did a bunch of holiday stuff. And then I'm running out of money, so I thought I'll go over to Sydney and see if I can get some work. My other friends had got work in Perth. Went to Sydney, got a job at the Crow's Nest Hotel in the bottle shop. So I was working as a bottle shop attendant at the Crow's Nest Hotel, settled into a backpacker house in Crow's Nest, and things are going swimmingly for a couple of weeks. And then I thought, I'm going to look up the church, because when I was in Perth, I looked up the church over there. I went to Mount Lawley Seventh-day Adventist Church, met some wonderful people. They showed me around town. That was great. Came over to Sydney, working at the Crow's Nest Hotel. Went to Chatswood Seventh-day Adventist Church. I remember leaving the house about 8:30 in the morning because they had Sabbath school, and then they had church, then they had a church lunch, and then they had an afternoon meeting. And I think it was the first time that I was there that had the afternoon meeting, and the pastor was there after the afternoon meeting, after lunch, and he said, well, I'm going to go and visit some of the people that are in the visitors book. Who'd like to come with me? And he's looking around the crowd, and nobody's budging an inch, and I said, I'll go. And I went with the pastor to go and visit some of the people in the visitors book, and I got home about 5:30 that evening, and I remember Jim, who was one of my other backpacker mates from the UK, he said, where you been all day? I said, well, I've been to church. You've been to church all day? I can't believe it. He couldn't believe anybody would go to church all day long. Anyway, cut a long story short, I ended up having Bible studies with that pastor, and I was beginning to pray because I realised that the Bible was true, and I realised that God was true, and I realised that Jesus is coming. And I knew I was coming to decision time. And I'm studying the Bible towards baptism, and I'm praying and I'm saying, Lord, if you want me to become a Christian, which is a really interesting prayer to pray, Lord, if you want me to become a Christian, find me some work in the church. And the reason I prayed that prayer was not so much that I wanted to work in the church, it was rather because I knew myself that if I was not 100% involved all the time, I would be out there. I mean, my notion was I was going to be in Sydney for 3 months, get baptised, jump on a bus, go to Brisbane and complete the tour of Australia, because I'm only here for a year, right? And I'm being convicted, and do I get baptised? If I'm going to get baptised, I need to find some work in the church to keep my focus on the things that really matter. Because I knew myself, I'm weak. Well, anyway, I'm doing a Bible study with the pastor. We're not long before we get to baptism date. And he said, I've been praying that the Lord will find me a young volunteer to do some programs in the church. I said, well, I've been praying that the Lord will find me some work in the church. He said, well, maybe the Lord's putting us together. And I went and knelt down by my bed and said, Lord, is this really what you want me to do? And it was as if God said, here it is. You asked for it. Here it is. What do you want to do? And I said, okay. And I put my lot in with the Lord. And I got baptised. And a week later, I began working as a volunteer for the Greater Sydney Conference. And what was interesting about that is I was working at the Crow's Nest Bottle Shop, so I knew to give that job up. Before I gave up the job, I became convicted. I was living in a backpacker house. Have I gone too long? Do you want me to stop? You better be sure about that. I'm in a backpacker house. The next door neighbours are two nice girls living next door, and I used to poke my head over the fence and chat to them. And they invited me over to a party. And I went to that party and I got drunk, which is not untypical. But I remember sitting outside in that party, and I was sitting at a table outside. There's a guy across from me I'd never met before. He'd never met me before. And he's drunk, I'm drunk, and I'm telling him about the mark of the beast. And I remember getting up from that conversation and going into the house and going to the bathroom, shutting the door and looking in the mirror and thinking, what an idiot. What an idiot. What does this guy think of me? And I realised that night that either I was going to be a drinker or I was going to be a Christian. And I gave up drinking that night. I had one beer since that event. And I gave up drinking because I was convicted that I could be a Christian or I could be a drinker, or I couldn't be both. I didn't want to be in the pub on Wednesday and in the church on Saturday. And so I quit drinking even before I'd done a Bible study on the subject. Anyway, I got baptised, and that's my baptismal day on the 19th of June 1993. Got baptised, began working as a volunteer for the church, not really knowing anything, but learning a lot. And about 6 weeks later, I had a bartender buddy from working in the bar in Birmingham. He was an American, and he'd gone back home to the States, and he was getting married to his fiancée, and he invited me to the wedding. And I said to him, if I can ever make your wedding, I'll be there. And so I emptied my Westpac Advantage Saver account of $1,800, and I flew from Sydney to LA to Minnesota, spent a week there, saw my friend get married, and then came back. Got a week off work from the church to do that. I come back to Sydney. It's a Tuesday morning. I'm praying by my bed, and at this time I'm probably a little homesick. I've been away for about 9 months from home. I don't have anyone special in my life. And so I pray and I kneel down on a Tuesday and say, Lord, I need you to find me a wife. And the reason I prayed that prayer was not that I was that desperate, but I wanted God to find me a wife. I knew that if I was going to marry anybody, it had to be somebody who believed the things that I believed, the things that I had discovered. And I prayed that prayer on a Tuesday, and I met Marie on Friday night. 3 days later. And I've been praising the Lord ever since. I'm not sure Marie has, but anyway. But met Marie 3 days later. A month later we started dating, and we've been married for 28 years since. So that's been a wonderful gift from God. Sometimes people will come up to me and say, will you pray for me to find a wife? It doesn't always work that way. But that's what happened to me. And I think God was proving himself to me time and time again throughout that year and letting him know that he was with me. And so we started going out and met Marie. When I started working for Pastor Metcalf, by the way, that's Pastor George Metcalf, when I started working for him, he gave me a copy of the Pictorial Aid for Bible Study, wrapped in cellophane, printed at the signs. And he says, here, Peter, I want you to read this, learn it, and use it. And I said, wow, look at this. I got one of my own. Here I am in Australia, and I've got one of these folders that Steve had tried to show me way back when. And so I worked for the church until the end of the year when my visa ran out, went back home to England, wanted to come back to Australia, but they wouldn't give me a visa for a while. Marie came over for a couple of weeks' holiday. We were there. We had 9 months apart from this long-distance relationship before texting, you know, lots of phone cards if you remember those. But eventually came back, got married in 1995, and then I was working at the Sydney Adventist Hospital, which is where Marie was working. Worked there for 6 months, and then we got an opportunity to work at the Warburton Healthcare Centre. Because of my restaurant work, I was able to get a job as a restaurant supervisor in the Warburton Healthcare Centre. And I worked there for about 1 year and 3 quarters. And then we were expecting Daniel, our son. And you do restaurant work for a while, but then you don't want to work weekends or evenings, especially when you want to settle down and have a family. And I thought, I want to be in church every week. I want to be there with my son and my family, you know. I wondered if there's any jobs going at the Science Publishing Company. And so I went to the Science Publishing Company. I went into the shop, and Verley was there. And I said, are there any jobs going here? And she said, well, she went and found out, and she said, there is a job going for a mature bookbinding apprentice. And I thought, well, and I was told, you're going to have to reduce your wage by 1/3 to take the job. And Marie's going to have to give up work because she's having Daniel. And we're trying to buy a house. And we prayed about it, but it seemed to be the right thing to do because it was going to be better for the family, and so we did that. And on the first day that I'm working at the Science Publishing Company, we're working on the Pictorial Aid for Bible Study. Now, we didn't work on that folder every week. We didn't even work on that folder every year. But the day I started, that's what we were working on. And a shiver went down my spine because I thought, I've come home. This is where I'm meant to be. And so you can forgive me for thinking this is a special place for me. That's a special place for me. And I got to work there and live next door to Murray. And I got to work there for 7 years. And then God says, I have something else I want you to do. And he called me into ministry. And I might tell that story another time. But God is an amazing God, and I still believe that God can reach anyone, anywhere. Never stop praying for people. I'm sure Steve was praying for me. He probably thought, he's a hopeless case. You know, for 3 years he was trying to show me stuff, and I'm saying, yeah. You know, but thank the Lord, he persevered. And keep praying for people. God has people everywhere that are wistfully looking towards heaven. I want to read a passage from Ephesians, and then I promise I'll stop. Ephesians chapter 3, 14 to 21. I love this passage. Paul writes, he says, for this reason I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and the length, the depth and the height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. To him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen.